You were never a hero, Ward. Just a coward who survived. That's what Sheriff Pike spat at him right before a loaded gun trembled in his hand, aimed straight at Elias's chest in the middle of a crowded church. And yet Elias didn't flinch. No badge, no voice, no defense, just the silence of a man who'd been misunderstood for 20 years. Before we dive in, let me know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. Elias Ward sat at the corner booth in Maggie's diner, the one by the frosted window that leaked too much cold and just enough light to remind a man winter never truly left Coldwater. His coffee had gone lukewarm, but he kept it steady, fingers wrapped tight around the mug as if it tethered him to something warmer than this town. Voices carried in that place, not because people shouted, but because Coldwater was small and memory made for poor insulation. "I don't know why she still lets him in here," a woman murmured behind the pie case. Ruth Malone. Her tone rang sharp like a church bell struck too often. A man like that sitting there like nothing ever happened. "She always did have a soft spot for strays," another replied. Elias stayed still. He'd mastered long ago how to quiet himself, how to breathe unnoticed in plain sight. He fixed his gaze out the window, watching a boy scatter salt on the steps outside the pharmacy boots. Too big scarf dragging. Across the street, the war memorial stood buried to its knees in snow. The diner door burst open with a rush of wind. Sheriff Pike entered, heavy boots thudding on tile snow sliding from the brim of his hat. He offered no words, only a look Elias's way, as if checking whether a fire had burned itself out. Elias set the mug down, slid a $5 bill under its rim. Maggie glanced his way, steady, unreadable, before turning back to the register. Outside, the cold struck sharper. He pulled his coat tight and walked toward the alley behind the diner, where his sled waited, axe strapped secure. The trail home cut along the edge of town, past shuttered market stalls and windows, with blinds drawn just enough to let eyes follow unseen. Children paused their games as he passed. One boy raised two fingers, like a mock pistol, and whispered, "Boom!" No one corrected him. No one stopped the boy. Elias kept moving. The forest received him with a hush, not the brittle chill of town, but a listening kind. Snow ground beneath his boots as he reached the cedar grove. He worked without rush, each swing of the axe precise, deliberate. Wood split, toppled, stacked. The rhythm didn't soothe, but it steadied something inside that had rattled loose for years. By the time the light drained low, he had filled the sled. His breath lifted in slow clouds. He glanced up once through bare limbs toward the dimming sky. No stars yet, just gray above and white below. He trudged home with the sled dragging behind his shadow long across the snow. At the cabin, he left the stove cold. Instead, he sat at the bench, pulled a block of cedar close, and set the knife to its grain. Shavings curled to the floor, catching the thin light as the blade moved with unbroken steadiness through the wood. A sudden gust rattled the cabin walls, scattering wood shavings across the floor. The knife stilled in his hand. Another slam followed, shutters clattering like loose teeth, and the room dimmed as the storm pressed harder against the timbers. Elias set the blade aside and crossed to the stove. The fire had thinned. He'd left it untended for over an hour, letting the cold seep in on purpose. There was something honest about cold. It never pretended to be more than it was. Then within the howl of wind, another sound slipped through. Faint, almost swallowed. A cry, or just echoes from winters that refused to stay buried. He rose slowly, pulled his coat from the hook by the door canvas, stiff with years of wear. His movements stayed unhurried. He hadn't rushed in a long time. When he opened the door, the gale struck him hard, driving snow across the threshold. He narrowed his eyes against the sting and lifted the lantern. Its glow carved a small circle through the dark, just enough to reveal the shape curled beside the porch steps. A dog, large, German shepherd by its frame. Muzzle crusted with ice, one hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood darkened the snow beneath, melting a shallow hollow into the drift. Elias gripped the doorframe tighter. He lived by rules. Rules kept him apart but alive. No attachments, no visitors, nothing that bled into his world to remind him how care could ruin a man. The dog lifted its head. Its gaze met his, not begging, not wild, but steady, alert, in pain without panic. He cursed under his breath. A moment later, he was dragging a wool blanket from the back of the chair and wrapping it clumsily around the animal's body. No growl came, no snap of teeth, only trembling muscles twitching under the weight of cold and hurt. Back inside, he set it down near the stove, the floor still holding warmth from earlier heat. The fire was nearly out, so he crouched low, fed in a few dry splits, then coaxed the flame back to life with careful breath. Fire caught. Shadows stretched across the walls. He reached for the battered first aid box on the shelf above his workbench. His hands worked on their own, cleaning the wound, binding the leg, checking the pulse. Old instincts rising without thought. "Stay still," he muttered, though he expected nothing. The dog didn't resist. It let its head sink against the floorboards, eyes following his every move. The bleeding had slowed. The slash along its flank looked like barbed wire or a trap had done the damage. He'd seen far worse. When he finished, he poured water into a bowl and nudged it closer. Then finally he saw the collar. Half hidden in matted fur, the band was thick military issue. The scratch tag became legible once he rubbed it clean. K9 Unit, Helena. He leaned back, forearms on his knees, breath caught between unease and memory. Helena was 3 counties away. A military town. Training center. Federal contracts. This wasn't someone's pet, which meant someone would be searching, which also meant someone might already be close. His glance flicked toward the window and froze. A slow sweep of light crawled across the frost-glazed pane. Headlights. His chest tightened. He edged closer, careful not to shift the curtain. Down the hill, a familiar black and white cruiser idled, engine humming against the snow. Sheriff Pike. The beams lingered, searching. Elias stayed motionless. Only the fire's low crackle and the dog's ragged breathing broke the stillness. At last the cruiser rolled forward, its glow fading into the storm-swallowed road. Elias exhaled long and thin. He turned back. The dog's ears had lifted slightly, eyes steady on him despite the pain. "You," he said, voice dry, "are gonna be trouble for my peace?" He let his hand pass slowly over its back. The fur was damp, coarse near the wound, yet warm underneath. He fed another log into the stove. Sparks leapt up the chimney. Then he sank onto the bench as the storm battered the windows. The cabin held its own, lit by firelight, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of 2 living beings breathing through the night. Ash sagged in the stove with a faint hiss. Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder, cold air brushing his ankles as he stepped onto the threshold, mug loose in his hand. Snow banked across the yard. Faint tracks pressed in, staggered at first, then sure. He squinted, following the pattern, like brushstrokes leading outward. Prints that spoke not of leaving, but of staying. Inside, the dog settled by the stove, eyes half-lidded, breath even now. The wound would heal, Elias figured, if infection didn't set in. He had cleaned it twice already, rubbing alcohol, old gauze care he hadn't offered a living creature in years. And yet there it was, watching him, always watching. Even now, half asleep, the dog's ear twitched when Elias shifted, as if it refused to rest fully in his presence. It shadowed him from room to room, voiceless, but present as heat and bone. He tried to ignore it, pouring fresh water, folding yesterday's blanket, then working the grime from the broken collar. The metal resisted him, sticky with grime and dried blood. But as he turned it under the oil lamp, something sharp caught the light, a line of tiny numbers etched inside the curve. Barely visible, but unmistakable. 7 digits. A code. Not a name, not a registration, a file number. His hands paused. For a long moment he just sat, holding the thing like it might speak. Then he slipped it into a small tin box beneath his bed, the one where he used to keep letters from his unit, now buried under packets of salt and matches. The fire popped behind him. He didn't turn. Wind slid back over the ridge, carrying a thin braid of laughter from down the hill. He stepped onto the porch in time to see her red scarf coat, 2 sizes too big, boots scuffed at the toes. The girl stood at the fence line. Marlo, Pike's granddaughter. She raised a hand high and waved like she'd done it every day for years. "Hey, mister," she yelled. "You got a dog now." Elias didn't answer. He shifted his weight, one hand on the post, the other still clutching the coffee cup gone cold again. "I saw you yesterday from the ridge," she continued, undeterred. "He looks like a soldier, not a pet." Valor patted outside. The dog's gait still carried a limp, but its tail gave one small sway. It moved toward the fence, not with aggression, but with interest. Marlo giggled. "He's not scary at all," Elias cleared his throat, meaning to say nothing. but the words slipped out low and rusted. He used to be a real soldier. The girl's smile widened. She dropped into a crouch by the fence, hands in her pockets, rocking on her heels. What's his name? I didn't give him one. Then I will. He should have refused, sent her off, warned her about teeth and men who don't talk over fences. But instead he just stood there, eyes flicking between the girl and the ridge, beyond where a car had begun its slow crawl up the hill. Black and white, sheriff's decal dull in the afternoon sun. He stepped off the porch, slow but firm. You need to go, he said, not sharp, not cruel, but solid like a door gently closing. Marlowe's brow furrowed, but she didn't argue. She straightened, dusted off her coat, and gave him a mock salute. See you tomorrow, then, she said with a grin. She turned and walked the trail back to town. Elias watched until her scarf disappeared into the tree line. Valor remained by the fence, ears forward, tail motionless now. The cruiser rolled closer. Elias stepped back onto the porch, not hurrying, but not waiting either. He didn't go inside, just leaned on the railing, waiting to see if the sheriff would stop again or keep going this time. The engine downshifted, tires gripping the incline. Headlamps washed over his face and drained into the trees. He stayed there, knuckles on the tin's edge, until the cruiser's noise thinned to nothing. His fingers still cold from the railing, he hitched his lapels higher and started down the road. The tin box pressed against his ribs with every step, heavier than it should have been. As he reached the first houses, the wind had softened, though the cold still clung like a debt. It had been weeks since he'd walked this far. The shelves at home were thinning. Valor needed bandages, the lamp needed oil. He kept moving. Maggie's diner sat warm behind fog glass, the clink of forks and low laughter muffled by distance. He didn't stop there. Instead, he slipped around to the back alley and entered the supply store through the side entrance where the bell didn't ring. Even so, his presence was noticed. The moment he stepped inside, conversation dried up like spilled liquor on a summer porch. People flicked their eyes over him and withdrew. A few kept their gaze long enough to make the point. He worked his way through the narrow aisles, lifting gauze canned meat and a small bottle of iodine. At the oil shelf, he hesitated, then added a second tin. Just in case. Near the counter, a boy tugged on his mother's coat sleeve and whispered, "Mom, is that the man with the lost police dog?" The woman hushed him quickly, pulling the child close. Elias kept his eyes on the shelf of chewing tobacco. Sheriff Pike stood at the other end of the store, leaning against the counter with a lazy sort of authority. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered weapon, not in threat but in habit. He always touched it when Elias walked into a room. "Find anything in the woods lately?" Ward Pike asked, voice loud enough to carry across the entire store. "A lost pup, or maybe some secrets too old to stay buried?" Elias placed the items on the counter, slid 2 crumpled bills from his coat pocket and set them beside the gauze. He let the words pass like weather. Pike stepped closer. "You always were good at keeping things quiet." Elias met his gaze, steady but unreadable, then turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. But before he reached the corner, a voice trailed from behind a stack of cereal boxes. "If he's hiding a K9 unit," a woman said, hushed but sharp, "who knows what else he's hiding?" Snow grated under his boots as he made his way through town. A different kind of cold had settled over the streets, one made of eyes that followed too long and voices that waited for distance before biting. By the time he reached the tree line, dusk was already creeping through the branches. Back at the cabin, the coals were dull, but the room held a resin-sweet heat. Valor lay curled by the hearth tail, thumping softly at the sound of the door. Elias knelt beside him, stroked the space between his ears and whispered, "They're circling now." The dog shifted closer. When the wind finally sagged, Elias slid the tin from under the bed and snapped it open. Inside, alongside the broken collar, lay a photograph. 3 men in desert fatigues, all young and sunburned, grinning like fools at a joke already forgotten. Elias, Samuel Pike, a third soldier whose name no longer came easily. The words scrawled along the edge had faded, but they were still there. Platoon 17, Reconstruction Detail. Helena Base. On the back in handwriting, rough with haste and dirt, "If I don't make it, protect what's left." His throat tightened. Not guilt. Not this time. Something deeper. Older. He flipped the photo and searched the young faces for what he'd missed. The door rattled once in the wind. Valor lifted his head, ears pricked. Elias walked over and slid the bolt into place, not hurried, not afraid. He pressed a fresh split into the coals. Light wavered over the tag on the table, slick and mute. At daybreak, he stepped onto the porch, one hand cupping coffee, the other steady on the rail. The fog had come in thick, muffling the tree line into a blur. A flicker of color caught his eye, blue against the gray. It dangled from the fence yarn, uneven, one end longer than the other. A child's scarf, clumsy but careful. Pinned beneath with a twig, a folded scrap of paper curled damp at the edges. For the watchman. M. He held still. The warmth from the mug seeped into his palm, distracting him from the tighter ache in his chest. Valor padded forward, sniffed the air, then the scarf. The dog paused, nose twitching, and looked back at Elias, then sat quiet, expectant. Elias reached over the fence, fingers grazing the yarn. The texture was coarse, clumsy knots. Someone had tried their best. He didn't need to unfold the note. The handwriting was Marlowe's, too neat to be practiced, too innocent to carry anything but truth. He hesitated and draped the scarf gently around Valor's neck. The dog kept the scarf and eased back onto the board's eyes on the road tail, ticking slower and slower. But the stillness didn't last. By late afternoon, the first rock hit the shed's tin wall with a hollow thud. Elias stepped outside. The fog had thinned, revealing a line of figures across the clearing. 4 boys' backpacks slung jackets oversized. Another stone arced through the air and landed near the woodpile. "Give back the damn police dog," old man one shouted. "You don't get to keep what's not yours." Another voice. "You're not even a real vet. You just let people die." The last one barely more than a whisper. "Traitor." Valor rose, slowly, didn't bark, just stepped forward and stood between Elias and the fence, body low, tail stiff, a statue carved from bone and will. The boys didn't throw again. They lingered. Then, seeing no reaction, turned and vanished into the trees. Elias let them vanish into the trees. That night, the knock never came. Pike didn't bother with formalities. The sheriff shouldered into the cabin, his soles rasping the boards. Snow melted in clumps from his coat. Elias sat at the table, unmoving. "You're harboring federal property," Pike said, voice dry as tinder. "That animal belongs to Helena's K9 unit, and you know it." Elias didn't look up. "It crawled here bleeding. I didn't ask for it." Pike's mouth bent into a smile with no warmth in it. "Maybe not, but you didn't report it either. Makes folks wonder what else you've kept quiet." Valor stood at the doorway to the next room, watching. Pike glanced at the dog, then back at Elias. "Don't make me dredge up what happened in '03. People have been kind letting you rot out here, but we both know one headline's all it takes to dig bones out of the dirt." Elias finally looked at him. "Sam's the last person who'd want you talking about the past." Pike's smile dropped. "You think you know what my brother wanted?" Elias said nothing. The room went quiet. The wall clock counted off a slow, stubborn beat. Pike stepped back toward the door. "Try me, Ward. When this story hits the news, don't expect anyone to back you. Especially not the girl." He left without slamming the door, which somehow made it worse. Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke from someone else's chimney. Inside, Elias opened the drawer by the sink and pulled out a small, unfinished block of wood oak, dense and pale. He held it for a moment, then set it on the table next to the old photo. He sharpened a small chisel, laid the tip against the grain, and began to carve. He carved what rose in his hands, arms folded under a soldier's weight, fingers locked on a flag's edge. By the door, the blue scarf lifted in the draft, a slim streak of color against the low lamplight. The same draft followed him out at dawn, carrying the smell of wet earth as he walked toward the stream with a bucket in one hand. His knuckles ached from the night's carving, stiff with cold. Valor padded alongside the blue scarf, damp with frost ears, flicking at every rustle. Elias crouched by the bank, dipped the bucket into the sluggish water, then set it down before reaching for the dog's collar. The ring had twisted over time, collecting dirt, rust, and dried blood. He wiped it clean with the edge of his sleeve fingers, clumsy but careful. As the grime peeled away, a thin, nearly invisible series of etched characters revealed themselves, curved against the inner metal, like a secret hiding in plain sight. "K9 Hell 972X L3. He read it twice, then a third time. Something about the sequence tugged at a memory he hadn't visited in years, a designation whispered across encrypted channels during his last assignment. In Helena, one never repeated after the mission fell apart. Elias stood abruptly, sloshing water onto his boots. Valor's ears twitched. The wind stirred through the trees like breath drawn in surprise. Back inside the cabin, Elias set the bucket near the stove and dusted off the old shortwave receiver, its casing yellowed and knobs rusted from years of disuse. He hadn't touched it since the day he'd turned his back on uniform and command. But today, something different pressed at the edges of him. He tuned it slowly, turning the dial with steady hands until static gave way to a soft mechanical tone, then a voice. Not human, not natural. A recording or system response clipped in neutral. Unit 972X, designated missing, internal case sealed, contact restricted. The transmission looped once before cutting out. Elias sat still in the fading light, breath shallow. He slid a blank cassette into the tape recorder, mounted beneath the table, and rewound it to 0. Pressed record. The voice echoed again. This time he captured every syllable. As the machine clicked off, he leaned back, staring at the collar still clutched in his hand. The cold metal bit into his palm. This wasn't just a lost dog. It was a shadow from another war. The knock at the door startled neither of them. Marlowe stood there with her boots untied and cheeks flushed from running. She held up a dented can of soup like a trophy. "Stole this from Grammy's pantry," she said, grinning. "Chicken and stars." Elias stepped aside, letting her in with a small nod. The stove crackled as he set the soup to warm. She sat cross-legged near Valor, scratching his ear like they'd been friends forever. "I saw you at the store," she said softly. "They were mean, but they're wrong. You're not scary." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "People see what they want. Fear's easier than understanding." She looked up. "Is that why you don't come to church anymore?" Elias's gaze didn't waver. "I stopped going when people started whispering louder than they prayed." She frowned. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "But it's true." They sat in silence for a while, the soup simmering and popping on the stove. Valor's tail thudding gently against the floor. After she left, bundle of warmth disappearing into the trees, Elias opened the drawer beneath his workbench and retrieved a hollowed cedar log. From inside, he removed a small roll of cloth and unwrapped it. He placed the tape still warm from the recorder and the collar tag inside, then sealed the log shut with wax, carved a small cross at the end, and slipped it beneath the floorboards with the ease of someone who'd hidden worse. The wind rattled the shutters, once sharp and sudden, making Valor lift his head. Elias pressed the chisel back into the cedar block, letting the curl of wood fall across his knuckles. The next strike of wind didn't just rattle, it slammed, shaking the cabin as if the walls themselves groaned. Snow hissed through the cracks, a warning carried on air already thick with ice. Elias tightened the bolt on the door, but the gusts kept pounding harder each time until it felt less like weather and more like siege. By mid-afternoon, the sky outside had vanished into a wall of white, and the radio crackled with warnings, roads closing by 4, travel not advised. Valor shifted closer to the stove ears, twitching at each blow against the windows. Then came the knock, not frantic, not polite. Just 2 short raps followed by a pause like the breath before bad news. Elias opened to a man bundled in a gray parka, face nearly hidden beneath layers of scarf and snow. "It's Marlowe," the man said, barely audible over the howl of wind. "She left the church after choir practice. Never made it home." Elias didn't speak. He just stepped back, grabbed the flashlight, and reached for the door. He didn't take a coat. Valor was already up, pressing against his thigh muscles taut. No command was given, none needed. The snow swallowed them whole within minutes. The trail wasn't clear, but Elias knew these woods like memory. He moved by instinct, eyes scanning for depressions in the snow, for the disruption of footprints swallowed by the storm. Then just at the base of the ravine, he saw it, a tear in the white. Tiny boot prints staggered. One dragged slightly like she'd slipped. Then nothing. He moved faster. His lungs burned. The world shrank to breath and ice and branches clawing at his arms. At the edge of the stream, the water hadn't frozen fully. Thin ice cracked and reformed in strange shapes like broken glass trying to heal. And there, clinging to a half-submerged rock in the middle, Marlowe. One glove gone, lips blue. Her arms trembled with the effort of holding on. "Don't move," Elias said, but she couldn't hear. He slid down the embankment, the snow giving way beneath him. Valor leapt ahead, paws skidding across the slick edge before bracing near the bank. The water was worse than he remembered. It seized him instantly, an ancient bone-deep cold that made thought vanish. But he pushed forward, breaking ice with his fist boots scraping for traction. Marlowe sobbed once weakly. Her fingers began to slip. He caught her arm just as she started to fall. Valor clamped his teeth gently around her sleeve and braced. Elias heaved them back slowly, painfully, until they collapsed in a tangled, shivering heap on the shore. Marlowe coughed, water streaming from her nose and mouth. Elias wrapped her in his arms, lifted her, and started walking. The weight was nothing. The heat that drained from him was. Branches whipped his face. Snow blinded him. He kept going. She stirred once. "Why'd you come?" He couldn't answer. His throat ached too much to speak. By the time they emerged near the tree line that marked the edge of town, the wind had quieted just enough for him to hear the crunch of tires on ice. A cruiser idled at the top of the hill. Its headlights cut twin paths through the dark. At the center stood Sheriff Pike, arms crossed, jaw set. The barrel of his gun pointed down, not up. But his grip wasn't loose. Elias kept walking, boots dragging in the snow. Pike didn't speak right away. His gaze drifted from Elias's soaked clothes to the limp girl in his arms, to the dog trailing behind like a shadow. "Someone saw you near the woods an hour ago," Pike said flatly. "Thought maybe you lured her out." Elias didn't stop. She could have died. He passed the cruiser. The lights cast long shadows behind them, his Marlowe's Valor's three outlines etched in shaking light. From a nearby porch, someone called out, "Is she okay?" Another voice, "That's the vet's cabin, right?" What was she doing there? Elias kept walking. Behind him, the murmur trailed thin at first, threading through the cold as fresh flakes drifted down. By morning, the murmur had swelled into voices too sharp to ignore, pushing Elias into the church hall, where the air clung damp and cold. Fluorescents buzzed overhead, their light twitching against stone walls and wooden pews. Burnt coffee lingered at the back. He stood at the front, boots firm on the faded red carpet that had once carried weddings, funerals, Sunday confessions. Now it carried only suspicion. The townsfolk packed every bench. Coats still clung to shoulders, faces drawn tight with anticipation or disdain. Their eyes held him in place, same as chains. Sheriff Pike stepped forward, polished badge catching light like a warning. He didn't need a microphone. His voice was already shaped like a weapon. "This man," he said with a tilt of his head toward Elias, "has been hiding federal property, a missing K-9 unit declared out of service over a year ago. He refused to contact authorities. He's harbored it like contraband." Pike paused, letting the accusation hang. Then slower he added, "And he invited a child into that same cabin in a storm unsupervised. That girl could have died." A few murmurs scattered like crows startled from a fence. Someone muttered, "That ain't right." Another whispered, "I knew something was off." Elias didn't flinch. Pike's tone sharpened. "Don't forget who he is. Who he was. 20 years ago, he left good men behind. My brother, Sergeant Sam Pike, died because of this man's decision." Gasps stirred the air. A few nodded. A few looked down. From the side, Maggie shifted uneasily. She ran the diner, served Elias coffee for years, but said nothing now. Then slowly, Elias reached into the leather satchel hanging at his side. The sound of the zipper sliding open was soft, but it cut through the room. He placed 3 items on the folding table before him, deliberate like a ritual. First, a scratched metal collar with a broken tag. Next, a black and white photograph, creased edges, frayed, the ink nearly faded. Lastly, a yellowed cassette tape label peeled away with time. He pushed the tape into a dusty boombox someone had used last Christmas for carols. The click echoed. A hum, then a static, then Unit 972X. Designated missing, internal case sealed, contact restricted. The voice was cold, mechanized, undeniably real. Pike's jaw clenched. Then a new voice rose, gravelly, worn thin by years but steady. "I was there." From the far back, Wallace stepped forward. Gray beard, stiff, gate eyes like river stones. People turned in shock. Few had seen him outside his cabin in nearly a decade. "I was 3rd Squad. Platoon 17. Helena." He pointed at the photo on the table. "That's me. That's him. That's Sam." Silence folded over the room. Sam Pike gave the final order that night. Told Elias to pull the others out. Said he'd cover us. Elias didn't run. He obeyed. Carried me a mile on his back through mortar fire. I've got the shrapnel in my leg to prove it. He turned toward the sheriff. You've known that all along, haven't you? Pike's face lost all color. Whispers swelled into ripples. You lied. Why would you do that? You let us think he was a coward. Pike stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. His hand hovered near his belt, then fell away. A man from the fourth pew stood up. My brother served under Sam. Said Ward saved more lives that night than anyone else ever did. Another woman voice cracking asked, And the dog, why hide that? Elias finally spoke, his voice low. They didn't just lose a dog. They lost control of a record they tried to bury. That collar, that voice on the tape, it's not just about me. It's about what they kept from all of us. He paused. The whole church seemed to lean in. Valor wasn't lost. He was meant to disappear. So was I. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Someone clapped once, then again. More followed, a slow rise like the wind before a storm breaks. Pike didn't speak, couldn't. Elias gathered the collar, and the photo left the tape behind. As he stepped down the aisle, Marlo stood by the door, her scarf still damp from the night before. She didn't speak either, just reached out and touched his sleeve gently. Outside, snow fell again, soft this time, like something had been released. Inside, the church shifted, a low rumble building beneath the wooden beams. The rumble broke wide open. Half the benches surged forward, words flaring like sparks. He's innocent, he lied to us. Pike knew the truth. Others held back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, clinging to years of loyalty to a name carved in stone outside the courthouse. At the center, Pike stood, frozen lips, pale gaze locked on Elias. The photograph, the collar, the voice on the tape, all of it gnawed at something brittle inside him. Then he reached for his sidearm. The click of the safety going off echoed louder than the murmurs. Pike's hand trembled, but his arm raised with frightening steadiness. The barrel of the Glock pointed squarely at Elias's chest. Valor reacted before anyone else. With a low guttural growl, the dog threw itself between Elias and the muzzle shoulders, squared teeth, bared breath, steaming in the cold air, seeping through the stained glass windows. Its entire body red like a shield carved from instinct and blood oath. Marlo screamed. She broke from the crowd, darting down the aisle, her scarf trailing behind, like a streak of color in a black and white photo. She wrapped her arms around Valor's neck, clutching the dog like it was a lighthouse in a storm. Don't, she shouted. Please, no more. Elias didn't move at first, but something in her voice, or maybe the way the crowd held its collective breath, stirred him. He took a step forward, then another. The muzzle of the gun tracked his chest like a compass pointing north. Pike, Elias said, his voice neither pleading nor sharp, just firm, weathered. You want to end this, fine, but do it without hiding behind the uniform, without dragging your brother's name through your rage. The sheriff didn't answer. Elias kept walking, slow as forgiveness. He stopped barely 10 feet away, behind Marlo, behind Valor. You think pulling that trigger makes you loyal? Elias asked quietly. Sam died giving orders he knew would kill him. He trusted me to carry the burden. That trust is why I've kept my silence, why I carve faces in wood instead of speaking. A crack formed in Pike's expression, not one of anger, but of something older. Worn down. His grip slackened, just enough for his hand to drop slightly. Do it, Elias said. If all this time what you've wanted is to see me punished for surviving, then do it now. But don't let your grief make a liar of your brother. Pike's mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders rose as though to shout, but the breath never left him. He saw the little girl, the dog, the man who once carried his brother's body through gunfire. His arm fell. The gun lowered, then slipped from his grasp and thudded softly against the floorboards. Pike stared at it, dazed, as if it had fallen from someone else's hand. Marlo didn't move. She stayed wrapped around Valor, eyes wide, chest heaving. A hush spread like frost. Wallace stepped beside Elias, a cane gripped tight in his fist, jaw set like granite. Then Maggie emerged from the pews. She didn't speak, just stood beside them. A quiet procession formed not by command but by some deeper rhythm, the slow alignment of truth pulling people into orbit around Elias. The sheriff's knees buckled slightly. He turned and stumbled into a pew, sitting heavily, face buried in his hands. No one approached him. Not yet. Marlo finally rose. She reached for Elias's hand. He took it. Together, they turned toward the door, the weight of every gaze behind them. But Elias didn't feel heavy. For the first time in years, something inside him felt still. The dog patted silently at his heel. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Not the harsh flurry of a blizzard, but the kind that melts against your skin like breath. Street lamps hummed against the dusk. One flickered, then steadied. Elias stepped out onto the porch. Valor close behind Marlowe's scarf, still brushing his coat. Behind them, the church exhaled the noise trailing out into the night until only footsteps and murmurs remained. By sunrise, Town Hall's door groaned open. Sheriff Pike walked in, set his badge on the desk without a word, and turned away. His boots echoed once across the boards, then faded as the latch clicked shut behind him. Frost clung to rooftops and window edges when Elias stepped onto Main Street. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a sky caught between cloud and sun. He didn't expect a parade. He didn't want one. But something had shifted. People didn't avert their eyes. Some nodded short, quiet gestures that weighed more than words. A few, like Mr. Rosen at the hardware store, even offered a small salute. Maggie brought him coffee in a paper cup. No smile, just a low murmur. I never believed all of it. Elias nodded once and walked on. At the chapel, a room once stuffed with folding chairs and dusty hymnals had been cleared. Wax-polished wood gleamed beneath candles flickering in alcoves. There where the light pooled warm and gold stood the newest sculpture. A soldier, one knee bent, head bowed, one hand gripping a folded flag so tightly the knuckles were carved in strained relief. The other hand hung limp by his side, fingers curled as if holding a ghost. Elias hadn't given it a title. It didn't need one. Marlowe had been the one to lift the cloth. She'd stood still, Valor at her side, his ears perked, tail low but steady. The girl hadn't spoken, just rested a hand on the dog's back, like grounding herself in something real. Now Elias sat in the far corner, back against cool stone. Valor lay beside him, chest rising slow. A few children tiptoed in wide-eyed. That's him, one of them whispered. He saved the girl from the river. And the dog's like... Military, said another voice, hushed with awe. Elias didn't respond. But something inside him, something brittle and buried, settled. Not because of praise, but because they were no longer afraid to see him. No public apology came. No banners waved. But the glances he received no longer carried suspicion. They carried recognition. And for the first time, that was enough. By late afternoon, he'd returned to the cabin. The hike home felt less like retreat, more like return. Amber sunlight slanted through the trees, lighting up patches of snow that hadn't yet hardened into ice. The air held the scent of pine and smoke and cold earth. In the silence, Elias heard the steady crunch of his boots and the low click of Valor's claws on frozen dirt. Inside, he pulled a fresh block of cedar from the wall. Not the dry ones meant for fire, this one was set aside. He placed it on the bench, rubbed his thumb over the grain, and stared. For a long time, he didn't move. Then his hands found the chisel. He didn't carve a soldier this time. No flags, no helmets. Just the outline of a child with their arms wrapped around a dog's thick neck cheek resting in fur. He worked slowly, tracing the lines with care, letting the shape emerge like something remembered more than imagined. The wood was soft, but held firm. Every cut was a choice. The radio crackled under a thin layer of shavings. And this year's winter fair will feature pieces donated by a local veteran woodworker. The chapel sculpture, now open to the public, has drawn attention from neighboring towns. Elias paused only to blow away the dust. Golden flecks lifted into the lamplight, swirling like ashes caught midair. Valor shifted, then laid his head across Elias's boot. Outside, the wind had calmed. Snow began falling again, slow, silent, no longer hostile. Elias looked toward the window. The forest stood still, not watching, not waiting, just there. He didn't know what came next. He didn't need to. For the first time in decades, the quiet didn't press on his chest like a weight. He kept carving, not to bury the past, but to hold it in place, to give it shape, to remind himself that survival isn't just about staying alive. Sometimes it's about staying open, even if the world closes in. Cold water eased back into its winter rhythm like a wheel slowly returning to its worn groove. The snow had begun to crust along the roadsides, and the sharp bite of wind that once felt like a threat now simply reminded people to wrap their coats tighter and keep walking. Life moved forward, though, not all at once. Elias still woke early. The silence inside the cabin no longer clawed at his chest. It settled in him like an old friend, not entirely warm, but familiar in a way that didn't demand explanation. Valor stretched beside the hearth tail, thumping once, before curling back into sleep. The morning smelled of pine and ash. Wood chips clung to Elias's sleeves as he carved in the same rhythm he had for years, but now the pieces had names. Outside the cabin, a woven basket waited on the stoop. Elias bent to lift the cloth covering and found 3 fresh rolls, a small jar of apple butter, and a folded slip of paper tucked beneath the lid. The handwriting was thin but steady. "Thank you for saving my granddaughter." There was no signature, but the scent of cinnamon hinted enough. He didn't smile, not fully, but something tugged at the corners of his mouth. Each Thursday, Elias ventured into town. At first, no one said much, but the silence was different now, no longer heavy with suspicion. A few nodded. Maggie raised her eyebrows in what passed for a greeting. A boy from the feed store held the door open without being told. Little things, Elias noticed. In St. Helena's Church, the side altar no longer stood empty. The statue he had carved, soldier kneeling flag clutched tight, rested in the quiet space where shadows crossed stained glass. Around it gathered offerings, a blue scarf draped gently across the soldier's shoulder, a metal dog tag polished to a soft glow, tiny paper cranes folded by children's hands. Someone lit candles there every evening, though Elias never saw who. He never asked. Word was Pike had left town. Some whispered he'd gone to live with a cousin out near Denton. Others claimed he still walked the ridge trails at dusk, had pulled low a man who couldn't quite leave but had nowhere to return. Elias didn't search for him, but sometimes at the door of the church, a bundle of clean pine sat waiting. Raw wood, dry and untouched, wrapped in canvas. Elias would carry it home in silence. He never spoke of it, but those pieces always became something else: a boy with outstretched arms, a mother bent in prayer, a dog curled beneath a porch. Shapes from memory, softened by time. One evening while whittling, Elias paused and glanced across the cabin. Valor was no longer curled tight against the door. He lay sprawled in the center of the room, half on the old rug, ears twitching in sleep. He snored softly. The cabin felt different now, warmer, not in temperature, but in weight. The stillness that once pressed in like a second skin now sat beside him instead, calm and wide. He'd taken down the old curtain that covered the one small window. Light moved freely across the walls again. Marlowe visited sometimes. She didn't knock, just wandered up the path and sat on the log near the woodpile talking to Valor or humming to herself. She asked about the war once. Elias had answered slowly, not with names or blood, but with the way the wind felt just before everything went wrong. She listened without blinking, then handed him a crumpled drawing of a soldier and a dog beneath a big tree. "It's you and him," she said, "but you're not fighting. You're just sitting." Elias kept the drawing on the mantel. One Thursday as he passed the general store, a man called out, "You carving for the fair this year?" Ward Elias turned, nodded once. Maybe. Back in the cabin, he began shaping a new piece. Not a nameless face or a battle-worn figure. This time it was a child with her arms around a dog head nestled against its side. There was no flag, no helmet, just closeness. The shavings fell like snow across the floor. Elias leaned closer, fingers working with quiet precision. Outside, twilight gathered at the edges of the clearing. Inside, the fire cracked gently, filling the space where silence used to hide. The radio in the corner hissed and clicked to life, announcing, "This year's winter fair will include work by Coldwater's own veteran woodcarver, Elias Ward. His collection, titled Those Who Stayed, will be displayed beside the memorial wall." Elias didn't turn. He just kept carving, but his hands no longer trembled. The lines he cut were steady. He brushed the curls of wood aside and reached for the chisel again, breath slow, the room no longer waiting to collapse. And beside him, Valor stirred and let out a low, contented sigh. Winter's hollow returned like an old song, familiar humming low through the air, draped in soft white. The square glittered beneath strings of amber bulbs swaying gently between trees. Wood booths lined the cobbled paths, their cedar panels steamed by the breath of small heaters. Children clutched mittens, couples shared paper cups of cider. Laughter, once a stranger to this town in winter, moved like wind across snow. Elias's booth sat quietly near the church steps, tucked between a honey vendor and a knitter selling scarves the color of creekstones. He brought only 3 pieces. No signs, no pricing tags. Just a table with wood smooth as river-worn bone. A carved deer stood mid-step, antlers etched in spirals that seemed to hum when the light hit them. Beside it, a boy wrapped his arms around a large dog head, tucked into the nape of its neck. The third was smaller, more delicate. A girl reaching up, fingers woven through the weathered hand of an older man in uniform. Their faces blurred into the grain, but the eyes somehow were unmistakably alive. Marlowe darted through the crowd, cheeks flushed, her breath hanging behind her in bursts of silver. She called to Valor, who rose slowly, stretched, and settled back at Elias's feet. His presence alone held the booth like an anchor. Children stopped to pet him, gentle fingers running through his coat. He didn't flinch. A woman with a wool hat leaned toward another beside her. "Is that his granddaughter?" The reply came just above the hush of wind. "No, she's the granddaughter of the man who saved her." Elias heard but made no sign he had. He sat still, hands folded, gaze not fixed on any one thing. People came and went. Some paused, a few bought. Most simply stood for a moment longer than they needed to, as if breathing something in. Late afternoon brought Maggie. She stood at the edge of his booth, a man in a charcoal pea coat beside her, holding a folded sheet of paper and an expression carved somewhere between polite and hopeful. "He's from the St. Helena Veterans Home," Maggie said softly. "They're starting a new workshop for recovery patients, carving mostly. They need someone who doesn't talk too much." The man cleared his throat. "We were told you might prefer silence over speeches." "That works just fine." Elias didn't speak. He ran his thumb along a curl of shavings by his boot. After a moment, a child, perhaps 7, tugged at the hem of his coat. "Are you going to go?" He looked at her, eyes wide, mittens mismatched. She pointed toward the mountains beyond the town square, their ridges laced in white beneath a sky quietly burning orange. "I don't know," Elias said at last. She nodded as if that were a real answer. Valor rose slowly, ears flicking once toward the horizon. His breath came in a calm rhythm. He looked not at the crowd but toward the pine line where trail met forest, as if he too were considering. As the sky dimmed and the crowd thinned, booths were packed and folded away. Music faded into idle talk. Lanterns clicked off one by one. Elias stayed. He reached under the bench and pulled out a small block of cedar, rich, golden soft at the edge. From his coat he withdrew his knife, warm from his body heat, and rested the blade on the wood. His first cut wasn't hurried. It traced a palm-open fingers, reaching, not grasping, but offering. The light from the last lantern shimmered along the chisel's path. Behind him, someone whispered a goodbye. Another offered a gentle nod. He didn't reply. The night deepened. From the church tower, a bell rang once. The air smelled of snow and smoke. Elias bent forward, carving in slow arcs the way one writes a letter without knowing if anyone will ever read it. Valor sat nearby, watching nothing and everything, and the wood under Elias's steady hand began to resemble something both new and ancient, a gesture that needed no name, a story told in silence, stretching softly toward morning. Some scars don't fade. Some truths arrive too late. But sometimes the quiet persistence of one man and one loyal dog can reshape an entire town. Elias never asked for redemption. He simply showed up, carved piece by piece through silence, and let his truth speak without a single demand for forgiveness. We all carry ghosts, but healing begins when we stop running from them. If this story moved, you don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt journeys like this one.